Again, Harry S. Truman has completed the remainder of Franklin Roosevelt's term, and he's made the decision that he will run for his own term in 1948. Now we'll start with the Republicans because their party's in a little less disarray than the Democrats, and we're going to explain that to you. So we'll start with the Republican Party, and they are really considering two candidates for nomination at this time. Now, does anybody remember, and I'd be really impressed, does anybody remember who ran against Roosevelt in 1944 from the Republican Party, huh? Dewey. You're right, Thomas Dewey. So New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who had challenged President Roosevelt in the election of '44 and got beaten pretty handily, is one of the possibilities that the Republicans are looking at. The other was a senator from Ohio by the name of Robert Taft. Robert Taft. So during the election of 1948, the Republican Party is considering two candidates for nomination. New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who had challenged President Roosevelt in the election of 1944, and Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. He was the leading Republican in the Senate, and he had the nickname Mr. Republican. He was very well respected in the Senate and was very much considered as a possible presidential candidate here. He was also the son of a president, William Howard Taft. Okay, so he was probably the most popular Republican in the Senate at the time. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. He led the Republican Senate, and he had the nickname Mr. Republican, and he was the son of President William Howard Taft. Well, when the dust cleared at the Republican National Convention, Dewey ends up winning this nomination, and he's going to name kind of an interesting person that we'll be spending a lot of time talking about when we get into the 60s. He appointed or nominated California Governor Earl Warren as his running mate. So Thomas Dewey will run for the Republican Party for president, governor of New York. His running mate will be the governor of California, Earl Warren. You ever heard of the Warren Commission that investigated the president's assassination? Same fellow. He's going to end up being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about him later. Well, before the campaign even began, it appeared that the Dewey-Warren ticket would be a cinch for victory. There was a lot of problems going on. We had post-war problems, the economy wasn't very good, and Congress was controlled by the Republican Party, and they were not working at all with the Democratic President Truman. So most prognosticators, or whatever you call prognosticators, believed that the Republican Party would win, wouldn't even need to be a campaign. There were too many post-war problems going on under the Truman administration. The economy was poor, and the Republicans controlled Congress, and they were simply not working at all with Truman. Okay? And so it was kind of basically thought that Truman had no chance. Part of the reason that Truman had no chance also was the Democratic Party was split so bad. They just had so many disagreements. And I'm going to give you some examples, okay? Because really, there were a lot of people that were being considered in the Democratic Party. Now, Truman obviously is going to end up getting the nomination, but it was not easy. Southern Democrats really were unhappy about this new thought of civil rights for blacks. And so they were upset at the party because they could see the Democratic Party moving more towards civil rights. And so they split off and formed their own party called the States' Rights Party. So Southern Democrats, upset with the movement toward civil rights, because that's where they felt Truman was heading, split up and formed their own political party called the States' Rights Party. And we'll go to our board for the first time. And they nominate a senator from South Carolina by the name of Strom Thurmond. And I think it's J. Strom Thurmond on your ID sheet. This fellow right here, this guy served in the Senate longer than any man in American history, into his 90s. J. Strom Thurmond. Okay? J, period. It's on your ID sheet. Okay, and he was the South Carolina governor at the time. He ends up going into the Senate and serves in the Senate longer than any man in American history. J. Strom Thurmond. Okay? So, there's one faction of the Democratic Party. You've got Truman and his supporters, right? And then you've got the Southern Democrats who were unhappy with the issue of civil rights for blacks, and they form a new political party called the States' Rights Party, and they're going to support for nomination J. Strom Thurmond, who at the time was the governor of South Carolina. Well, another faction of the Democratic Party who was not thrilled with Truman split off and formed what was known as the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party. And they supported former Vice President Henry A. Wallace. If your memory's good, he served as Vice President in Roosevelt's third term. Okay? Fourth term was Truman, right? First and second terms were John Nance Garner. Okay? Harry A. Wallace was the Vice President during Roosevelt's third term. His supporters put together what was known as the Progressive Party and were supporting him for nomination. So what you have is you've got Truman and his supporters that believe he should have the nomination. You've got Southern Democrats who split off and formed the States' Rights Party who want J. Strom Thurmond to run for president. And you have this newly formed Progressive Party who want former Vice President Henry A. Wallace to be the nominee. The point being is Truman gets the nomination. However, when your party is split so bad, who's going to win an election? The other party. Anytime you have disagreements in a political party, the advantage goes totally to the Republican Party if that's the case. Now, on top of all this, they get to the Democratic National Convention and they're trying to pick this candidate, and another guy steps up to play. The Democratic senator, which you'll hear a lot about in the future, a fellow by the name of Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota, he steps up at the Democratic National Convention and he really pushes the Democratic Party to get on board for civil rights. Civil rights should be part of our platform. Black people are being treated poorly. We need to get some civil rights for blacks. Okay? So here you got kind of a messed up convention anyway. You've got three different parties, three different candidates fighting back and forth trying to decide who you're going to nominate. And then Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota stands up and gives a speech about how the Democratic Party ought to embrace civil rights. Well, that upset the Southern Democrats so bad, what did they do? They got up and left the convention. They just left. So the point is, this entire Democratic National Convention, when they're trying to pick a candidate, is just a disaster. It's a fight to the end. So I guess when the dust clears, Truman is going to get the nomination to run for president on the Democratic Party. But do you see why he's going to have such a tough time to win? He's got no support in his own party. What happens when Democrats don't like their own candidate lots of times? They vote for the Republican candidate. Happens a lot. So this is a bad deal. Well, now we'll talk about the campaign a little bit. And we'll tell you what Dewey did during the campaign and what Truman did, because they took unusual pathways, two opposite pathways. Now, you got to remember, Dewey ran against one of the most popular presidents in American history, in Franklin Roosevelt, 1944. Well, what do you have to do to win an election? You got to criticize your opponent, right? And Dewey took a lot of heat because of the criticism that he gave Roosevelt when he ran in 1944. So he decided, you know what, I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to have a conservative approach to campaigning. I'm going to be the nice guy. I'm going to be the complimentary guy. I'm going to be the warm and fuzzy guy. Okay, I'm not going to go blast Harry Truman. I'm not going to go blast Harry Truman. I'm going to build myself up rather than blast Harry Truman. Okay, and that's what we probably should be doing more today. But he takes a conservative approach, and I'm going to give you 3 examples of how he campaigned. Okay, here's how Dewey campaigned. Now, he was pretty smart. He used what we considered then modern technology to campaign. He actually created a feel-good films about himself that were shown in movie theaters across the country. And I think we saw that, did we not? When we watched the video the other day, it kind of showed you some of this, where they showed films where his life and what he had done, and he'd grown up and how he loved his mother, and all these feel-good films to portray himself as a person that would be a good president. So instead of criticizing, he portrayed himself as a good guy in some of these films using, at that time, which was incredibly modern technology. Okay? Dewey stayed consistent in his speeches and routines. He did, he'd speak to Macklin and he'd say this. He'd speak to Elise and he'd say the same thing. He'd come over here and speak to another group of people, Brady, and he'd say the same thing. He just stayed very consistent in what he was saying. Historians think almost too consistent. He got too kind of boring, repetitive, you know what I mean? But he stayed consistent in his speeches and routines. He did everything the same. If he went and spoke in New York, he spoke about the same things in the same manner. If he went to Dallas, he spoke the same way. He was very routine in his campaign. And the reason he did that's kind of the third reason. Dewey believed victory was in hand. He wasn't going to do anything to upset the apple cart. He was going to portray himself, not criticize his opponent. He was going to stay consistent, make sure he didn't make any mistakes. It's almost, if you get in athletics, sometimes you get in a big game and you're not trying to win, you're trying to keep from losing. And that's what he was doing. He was just, he didn't want to do anything that was going to mess this up because he was sure he was going to win. Now, Truman took a completely different approach. He was critical the entire campaign. But he really wasn't critical of Dewey. Who do you think he was critical of that he put pressure on daily? Because he claimed that these people kept anything from getting done in this country. It wasn't his fault. Congress. Very good. So what Dewey did is he criticized this Republican-controlled Congress, left and right, not Dewey but Truman. He concentrated his entire campaign on criticizing the Republican-controlled Congress. And he basically went around the country and said, if you elect Dewey as president, it won't be Dewey that'll be the problem. It'll be this do-nothing Congress. They didn't do anything to help me. They're not going to do anything to help Dewey. That's when he kind of pressed to the American people. And he basically told the American people that Congress was just stonewalling and on purpose were not passing any legislation to help the economy. It's not my fault our economy's crappy. It's not my fault that we got post-war problems. It's not my fault, it's Congress's fault. Because every time I try to do something for the American people to help the economy or help post-war problems, they won't support me because I'm a Democratic president. That's when he went around campaigning. Then this was kind of genius. He called Congress back into session. He called them back into session. They were on recess. He called them back into session. Why did he do that, Ivan? Because what he put at them when they got back into session. No, he put bills that he tried to get legislation through that would help the economy in these post-war problems. And did they cooperate with him when they were back into session? They did not. So Congress proved Truman was correct. They didn't pass one piece of a legislation in the 11 days they were back in session when he pressed them on laws to try to help the country. They didn't pass one thing. Because what were they waiting for? Dewey to be elected and have a Republican president. So he really was pretty genius on this, you know what I mean? And Truman was behind the whole campaign. I mean, he really was. If you look at the polls, he was behind the whole campaign. And he started to make some serious ground on Dewey late in the campaign, but even his closest advisors thought he had no chance to win. They felt if he had a couple more weeks before the election, he was making enough ground, he might have made a difference. But going into election night, or excuse me, election eve, even his closest advisors thought there was no way he was going to win, that he was going to lose this election. And that's how it was portrayed in the media at that time, okay? That Truman had no chance to win. The media believed that Thomas Dewey would be the next president of the United States. Now, the best example of this is when a particular newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, decided not to wait for the late returns to come in on election night, and they went to press with the famous headline that I'm going to pass out to you on the front of their paper saying, Dewey defeats Truman. And it was all over the East because that's an Eastern paper. They had went ahead and predicted victory way too early for Dewey. So the most public example of this was when a major newspaper in America printed a Dewey victory before all the results were reported. And deciding not to wait until the late returns in the western part of the United States, the Chicago Tribune made an infamous error in judgment on election night, and the following was published on the front page of their well-known newspaper, Dewey defeats Truman. Now really it wasn't even that close, surprisingly. We'll tell you about the popular vote. Truman won the popular vote 49% to 45%. That's a pretty good popular vote victory. So Truman wins the popular vote 49% to 45%. But what counts? Elise, popular vote, $1 will buy you a pop in the pop machine. What do you got to have to win? Electoral votes. Well, Truman had 303 electoral votes compared to Dewey's 189. And Thurman, J. Strom Thurman, even though he wasn't the nominee, actually received 39 electoral votes in this election, which was really unusual. So it told you that all the Southern Democrats voted for him. Okay? So Truman wins 303 electoral votes, Dewey 189, Thurman 39. Wallace didn't receive any, if you care. He got 0. Okay? Well, Alvin W. Barkley of Kentucky would be elected vice president with Truman. He had successfully served as both a member of the House of Representatives and the Senate. That was Truman's nominee for vice president, 48. So Alvin W. Barkley of Kentucky is going to be the nation's vice president. Now, this was kind of interesting because Truman was thrilled not only that he won, but what else happened on election night? Congress switched to being controlled by the Democratic Party. That was a big, big victory for Truman. So along with Truman's surprise presidential victory, the Democratic Party also regained control of Congress. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to continue the lecture, but we're going to start tomorrow with the video on the election of 1948 so we can get through it, okay? So we'll move on to Truman, what we call the fair deal, okay? So tomorrow when we come in, we'll watch a video on the election of 1948 so we can see it in its entirety. Okay, so we'll move on to the fair deal. What was the name of, Olivia, what was the name of Franklin Roosevelt's administration? Not the fair deal, but the New Deal. Remember I told you this is when administrations are going to start to be named, okay? So Roosevelt really has the first name of his administration, which was the New Deal. The name of Truman's administration will be the Fair Deal, okay? Now, you can imagine, because of the Democratic-controlled Congress, what's going to happen now? Truman's going to get a lot of what passed?
Bills.
The bills and laws. So between 1949 and 1952, I'm going to give you several examples of laws that Congress passed during Truman's fair deal. He had much more success with the Democratic-controlled Congress than he ever did with the Republican-controlled Congress. Okay? So here's some of the things that he passed. Not specific laws, but things they did. Okay? First one, and you all ought to appreciate some of these. The first thing was laws were passed that extended Social Security benefits to include 10 million more people. In other words, laws were passed that allowed 10 million more Americans to gain benefits from Social Security. It was pretty limited prior to that. So laws were passed that extended Social Security benefits to 10 million more people. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for American citizens. Anybody want to guess what the minimum wage was when Harry Truman was elected president an hour in 1948? How much was it an hour? Anybody want to guess? A little higher than that. 40 cents an hour. Now think about this. During these laws that were passed, that minimum wage went from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. What's the minimum wage now? What is it? $7.25. So can you imagine all of a sudden President Trump passes legislation that almost doubles that? All of a sudden now it's 12 bucks an hour. Wouldn't that be great? Now you'd never see that in your lifetime. So it needs to make a point that he raised the minimum wage. Don't look at 40 cents to 75. Look at the almost a doubling of the minimum wage. Did that benefit Americans and help the economy? Certainly did. Another thing he did is that we had a lot of slums in America, and we still do. But he passed laws that allowed the federal government to clear out slums and build 800,000 low-income housing units over a 6-year period of time. So they went in and tore down these slum areas where people were living in just horrible poverty, and the government paid for 800,000 new units to be built for low-income housing for people to rent. And it took them 6 years to get that done. From the time they cleared the slums to building the 800,000 low-income units, it took them about 6 years. That helped the American economy and people? Absolutely. Absolutely. What did they base their rent on? Anybody want to guess?
Your income.
Their income. That's what they did. Yep. And they still have those today. Okay? Another thing that was passed during the Fair Deal were laws that continued rent controls. What are rent controls?
Is
Put
it how
a
much
cap
you-
on how much you can charge somebody for rent. Okay? So that helped the American people. So he passed laws that continued rent controls. Another thing he did is he kind of extended what Roosevelt did with the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, for example. He brought laws in that put more employees under civil service. What does that mean? We created more jobs through the government to get people working, right? Remember Roosevelt did that to solve the unemployment problem? He had the CCC, for example, where people built, bridges and dams and stuff and put a lot of people to work. Well, Truman did the same thing. He passed laws that brought even more employees under civil service, which was originally initiated by Roosevelt's New Deal. So he got more people jobs. So he did a great job. Okay, he did a very good job. Matter of fact, I've said this before, I think Harry Truman might have been the most underappreciated president we ever had. He was just an